Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Story of Your Life. On today's episode, we're featuring the life of Mr. Virtual Machine, and I'm your host today, Stephen W. Thomas. Let's get started with today's show by meeting the guest of the hour. Joining us live from a secure, undisclosed data center is none other than Mr. Virtual Machine. Today we will walk through all the important people that have came together to help make Mr. Virtual Machine a reality. The first person we're going to meet as we walk through the life of Mr. Virtual Machine is the person responsible for his very creation, none other than Joe Developer. Joe Developer had completed some new code and wanted to be able to test it before he moved the code into production. Joe came up with the great idea of what if he had his own environment? What if he had his own virtual machine to do his isolated testing on? Joe took this idea to the second person that we come to in our story today, and that's when he made his official request to none other than Jane, IT Manager. Jane is Joe's IT Manager. Joe and Jane discussed the value of Joe having an isolated virtual machine for testing his code prior to moving it to production. After reviewing the budget, Jane asked Joe to make an official request through the help desk system. This brings us to the third person in our journey of the life of Virtual Machine. Once the request was submitted, it had to go to approval from none other than the Group Vice President. Due to the cost associated with creating a new virtual machine, the Group Vice President needs to review all help desk tickets asking for a new virtual machine. He had a few questions which he was able to get cleared up by talking with Jane and Joe. After talking with them, he approved the request, but only after he gets the request reviewed by the fourth person in today's story. The fourth person in today's story will really break down the numbers to determine the true cost of a virtual machine to this IT organization. Help me welcome a very special guest, Corporate Accounting. They will help determine if an existing project code can be used as a charge account for this virtual machine, or if a new account needs to be created. A virtual machine in this organization touches many different groups. It impacts internal IT, help desk, security, infrastructure, plus the capital costs associated if new hardware and software is needed to provision the virtual machine. After corporate accounting determines the cost of the virtual machine, we move on to the next person in our story. At this point, the request is totally approved and it's sent over to provisioning by no other than internal IT. Internal IT will use the corporate image to spin up a new virtual machine that Joe can use for his testing. But before Joe can actually log into the virtual machine, there's one more important individual that needs to be involved in the process. That brings us to a corporate security review and a very special guest, Joe IT Security. Joe IT Security is responsible for logging into the new virtual machine and adding Joe to the admin group. And with that, we would like to welcome to the world Mr. Virtual Machine with our first successful logon. Joe is now able to connect to the virtual machine and do his isolated testing. Now, Joe doesn't need the virtual machine indefinitely. He only needs it for a few days to complete his testing. Once Joe is done with his virtual machine, that brings us to the final chapter in the life of Virtual Machine, decommissioning. Decommissioning is a long road which may last several weeks to several months, where our virtual machine will sit in the data center without little activity. This has been the story of your life for Mr. Virtual Machine. Let's see if there's a better way. With Windows Azure Virtual Machines, we're able to cut days off the time for provisioning a new virtual machine. We're able to quickly create new virtual machines at a fixed known cost to our organization. This has been your host, Stephen W. Thomas, and I'm fast on Windows Azure.